The words left her mouth before she could stop them, and the whole table went silent. Cordelia Ashworth had just called the man across from her arrogant, selfish, and unworthy of respect, and she had said it loudly enough for every guest at the supper to hear. She did not know his name. She did not know his title. She only knew that he had spoken about tenants and land in a cold, careless way, as if people were numbers on a page, and something in her had snapped. The candles flickered. Forks stopped moving. Her aunt, seated at the head of the table, turned pale. The quiet man across from Cordelia simply looked at her, his face calm, his eyes sharp with something she could not read. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He only nodded slowly, as though her words had struck a place he already knew was tender, and then he returned to his meal without another word. Cordelia felt her cheeks burn. She had spoken with the confidence of a woman who believed she was addressing a minor gentleman, someone easily forgotten, not someone whose opinion could shape the future of her family. She had always been outspoken. She had always believed that honesty mattered more than manners, and she had never regretted saying what she thought, not once in her whole life. But something about the silence that followed told her this time was different. Her cousin Louisa leaned close and whispered a name into her ear. Cordelia felt the blood drain from her face. The name was not that of a minor gentleman. It was not the name of someone easily forgotten. It was the name of a duke, one of the wealthiest and most private men in the country, a man known for avoiding society, precisely because so many people wanted something from him. She had insulted him without knowing who he was, and now there was no way to take the words back. The rest of supper passed in a blur. Cordelia barely tasted the food in front of her. She could feel eyes on her from every direction, some amused, some horrified, some simply curious to see what would happen next. The Duke said little else that evening. He spoke politely to the woman beside him, answered a question about the weather, and once, just once, glanced across the table at Cordelia with an expression she could not name. It was not anger. It was something closer to curiosity, as if he were trying to understand what kind of woman would speak to a stranger with such fire and such carelessness. When the meal ended and the guests rose from their chairs, Cordelia tried to find a moment to approach him, to offer some kind of apology, but he was already gone, slipping out through a side door with the quiet ease of a man who had done this many times before, a man who knew how to disappear from a room full of people who wanted his attention. Her aunt found her in the hallway, gripping her arm with more strength than Cordelia expected from a woman her age. "You have no idea what you have done," her aunt said, her voice trembling. "That was the Duke of Norrington. He does not attend gatherings like this. He does not speak to strangers. And you have just told him, in front of a room full of people, that he is unworthy of respect." Cordelia opened her mouth to explain, to say that she had not known, that she would never have spoken so freely if she had understood who he was. But her aunt was already walking away, already thinking of ways to repair the damage that had been done. Cordelia stood alone in the hallway, the candlelight throwing long shadows across the wooden floor, and for the first time that evening, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had happened. She was not a woman who cared much for titles. She had grown up believing that a person's worth came from their actions and their character, not from the name they carried or the land they owned. She still believed that. But she also understood, standing there in that quiet hallway, that belief and consequence were two very different things. Her words had consequences now, whether she liked it or not, and those consequences belonged not only to her, but to her entire family. She thought of her father, whose modest fortune depended on the goodwill of families like the ones gathered in that house tonight. She thought of her younger sister, who had not yet had her first season, and who needed doors to remain open, not closed. She thought of her aunt, who had worked so hard to secure this invitation, believing it might lead to good things for all of them. And then she thought of him, the quiet man across the table. The way he had simply nodded and returned to his meal, as though her words had not surprised him at all, as though he had heard worse from people far more powerful than a young woman with an unguarded tongue. She wondered what kind of life made a man expect insults instead of kindness. She wondered why, of all the people in that room, he had chosen to listen to her so carefully, when everyone else had simply gasped and looked away. Cordelia did not sleep well that night. She lay awake in the small guest room her aunt had arranged for her, staring at the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again in her mind. Each time, she searched for a way the conversation could have gone differently, a way she could have expressed her opinion about kindness and duty, without turning her words into a weapon aimed at a stranger's chest. She found no such way. The words had already been spoken. The damage, whatever it was, had already been done. By morning, the story had already begun to spread through the house like smoke through an open window. Servants whispered about it in the halls. Guests exchanged knowing looks over breakfast. Cordelia felt every glance like a small burn against her skin, though she refused to lower her head or hide from the consequences of what she had said. If she was going to be judged for her honesty, she decided, she would at least face that judgment with her chin held high. Her aunt spent the entire morning trying to determine how to fix what had happened. Letters were considered and rejected. Visits were planned and abandoned. The Duke, it seemed, had already left the estate where the supper had taken place, traveling on to some other part of the country, leaving behind nothing but a name that now hung over Cordelia's future like a storm cloud that refused to pass. It was her cousin Louisa who finally spoke the truth, that everyone else seemed too afraid to say aloud. "You may have just ended any hope of a good match for this family," Louisa said quietly, as the two of them sat together in the drawing room. "Not because you were wrong about what you believe, but because you said it to the wrong man, at the wrong table, in front of the wrong people." Cordelia wanted to argue, wanted to insist that her beliefs mattered more than the comfort of powerful men, but she found she could not summon the same fire she had felt the night before. In its place was something quieter and more uncomfortable, a growing awareness that the world she lived in did not always reward honesty, and that sometimes the cost of speaking freely fell not on the speaker alone, but on everyone who loved her. She thought again of the Duke's face, in that final moment, the calm nod, the return to his meal, the flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. She had expected fury. She had expected him to demand an apology, or to storm away from the table in outrage. Instead, he had simply absorbed her words, as though he had built walls around himself long ago, walls strong enough to withstand far worse than the opinion of a young woman he had never met. That thought unsettled her more than anger would have. As the days passed and no response came from Norrington, Cordelia began to hope, foolishly perhaps, that the matter might simply fade away. Perhaps the Duke had already forgotten her. Perhaps a man of his position received insults so often that hers had blended into the background noise of his busy life. She almost convinced herself of this, almost allowed herself to breathe easily again. Then, on a quiet afternoon nearly 3 weeks later, a letter arrived at her family's home, carrying a seal she did not recognize. Her aunt opened it with trembling hands, and as she read the contents, her face shifted from fear to confusion, to something Cordelia could not quite interpret. It was an invitation, not a demand for an apology, not a threat, but a formal invitation for the entire Ashworth family to attend a gathering at Norrington Hall. Cordelia felt her stomach twist into a knot. She did not know what to make of it. Was this an act of mercy, or was it something far more calculated, a chance for the Duke to humiliate her in return, in front of an even larger audience than before? She thought of every possible reason a man might invite the very woman who had insulted him into his own home, and none of the answers brought her any comfort. Her aunt, however, saw only opportunity. This was not the letter of a man seeking revenge, she insisted. A man seeking revenge would not extend an invitation at all. He would simply let the insult stand, let it become a quiet mark against the family's reputation, whispered about in drawing rooms for years to come. An invitation, her aunt argued, was something else entirely. It was a door left open, and doors left open by dukes were not doors a sensible family refused to walk through. Cordelia was not so certain. She remembered the look in his eyes, the calm and unreadable expression that had followed her outburst. She could not decide if it belonged to a man who forgave easily, or one who simply knew how to wait. That night, she sat by her window for a long time, watching the stars appear one by one over the quiet countryside, and she found herself thinking, not of the shame she had brought upon her family, nor even of the fear that now sat heavy in her chest, but of him, of the man across the table who had said almost nothing, and yet had left her with more questions than she had ever expected to carry away from a single supper. She did not know, as she finally closed her eyes that night, that the invitation now resting on her aunt's writing desk would change the entire course of her life. She did not know that the man she had insulted so carelessly would one day know her better than anyone else in the world. She only knew that she had made a mistake, a costly one, and that somehow, Impossibly, that mistake had opened a door instead of closing one. Whatever waited for her at Norrington Hall, she understood she had no real choice but to face it. There was no undoing the words she had spoken. There was only the path forward, uncertain and unfamiliar, leading toward a man whose quiet strength frightened her far more than his title ever could. And though she could not have guessed it then, that path was leading her, step by uncertain step, toward becoming his Duchess. The carriage ride to Norrington Hall would begin at dawn. Cordelia did not know what awaited her there. But she knew, deep in her chest, that nothing would ever be the same again. The journey to Norrington Hall took 2 full days, and every mile felt heavier than the last. Cordelia sat across from her father in the carriage, watching the countryside change from familiar green fields to unfamiliar hills, and she found herself gripping the edge of her seat whenever the wheels struck a rough patch of road. Her father, a quiet man who rarely raised his voice, kept glancing at her with a worried expression he tried and failed to hide. "You need not fear this visit," he said at last, though his tone suggested he was trying to convince himself as much as her. "A man who wished to punish us would not open his home to us. He would simply let silence do the punishing." Cordelia wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the invitation was a kindness, a sign that the Duke had already forgiven her thoughtless words. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw his calm expression from that night, the way he had absorbed her insult without flinching, and she could not shake the feeling that a man capable of such control was also capable of patience, and that patience could be its own kind of danger. Her Aunt Margaret rode in the second carriage with Louisa and Cordelia's younger sister, Eliza, who had spent most of the journey asking eager questions about what a duke's home might look like. Eliza had not yet had her first season, and to her, the entire situation seemed less like a crisis and more like an adventure. Cordelia envied her sister's innocence, even as she worried about what damage her own mistake might do to Eliza's future prospects. When the carriages finally turned onto the long gravel drive leading to Norrington Hall, Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat. The estate rose ahead of them like something out of a story, its gray stone walls catching the late afternoon light, its windows tall and many, its gardens stretching out on either side in careful, disciplined rows of green. It was not a house meant to impress visitors with excess. It was a house meant to remind them of permanence, of history, of a family whose roots ran deeper than most. Cordelia had expected grandeur. She had not expected the quiet dignity of the place, the sense that every stone had been set with purpose rather than vanity. A row of servants stood waiting near the entrance as the carriages came to a stop, and among them, standing slightly apart, was a woman Cordelia did not recognize, dressed in fine but simple clothing, her expression polite and carefully neutral. She introduced herself as the housekeeper and explained that the Duke was currently occupied with estate matters, but would join his guests before supper. Cordelia felt a strange mixture of relief and disappointment at the delay. Part of her had been bracing herself to face him the moment she stepped out of the carriage, and part of her had hoped for exactly that, so the waiting would finally end. Instead, she was shown to a guest room on the second floor, a bright, comfortable space with a view overlooking the gardens, and left alone with her thoughts for the better part of an hour. She used the time to change out of her travel clothes and into something more suitable for the evening, though no dress she owned felt appropriate for facing a man she had insulted in front of an entire supper table. Louisa visited her briefly, offering a mixture of encouragement and warning. "Whatever happens tonight," Louisa said, "do not let him see that you are afraid. Men like that respect strength, even when it comes wrapped in trouble." Cordelia appreciated the advice, though she was not entirely certain it was true. She had seen so little of the Duke that she could not begin to guess what he respected or valued. All she had to work with was a single moment of silence and a single unreadable glance. As the sun began to set, a servant arrived to inform the family that supper would be served shortly, and that the Duke wished to greet his guests personally beforehand. Cordelia's stomach twisted painfully at the news. She smoothed the front of her dress with hands that would not quite stop trembling, and followed her family down the wide staircase toward the main hall. The hall itself was vast, lined with portraits of previous dukes and duchesses, their painted eyes seeming to watch the newcomers with quiet judgment. Cordelia tried not to look at them too closely, afraid that she might see disapproval in their painted faces, though she knew such a fear was foolish. Her aunt walked ahead, already composing the words of apology she intended to offer, rehearsing them under her breath like lines in a play. Cordelia's father walked beside her, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder in a gesture meant to offer comfort, though his own face betrayed a flicker of nervousness he could not fully hide. And then, at the bottom of the staircase, standing near the entrance to the main hall with his hands clasped calmly behind his back, was the Duke. He looked different than he had at supper weeks before. Gone were the plain, unremarkable clothes he had worn to avoid attention. In their place was the quiet elegance of a man fully at home in his own domain, dressed simply, but unmistakably as the master of the house. His expression, however, remained just as calm and unreadable as it had been that first night, and Cordelia felt her heart pound harder with every step that brought her closer to him. He greeted her father first, then her aunt, exchanging polite words that Cordelia barely heard over the sound of her own pulse in her ears. When his eyes finally settled on her, she forced herself to meet his gaze directly, refusing to look away no matter how much her instincts urged her to. "Miss Ashworth," he said, his voice calm and even, "I am glad you accepted my invitation." Cordelia opened her mouth, intending to offer the apology she had rehearsed 100 times during the journey, but before she could speak, he continued, "I hope you will forgive the delay this afternoon. Estate matters do not wait for polite timing, even when guests of interest have arrived." Guests of interest. The phrase lingered in the air between them, and Cordelia could not tell if it was meant as a warning or something else entirely. She searched his face for any hint of mockery, any sign that he intended to humiliate her before the others, but she found none. His expression remained maddeningly composed, giving nothing away. "I owe you an apology, Your Grace," she finally managed to say, her voice steadier than she expected. "What I said at supper was thoughtless and unfair. I spoke without knowing who you were, but that does not excuse the unkindness of my words." For a long moment, he said nothing, studying her with an intensity that made her want to look away, though she refused to give in to the urge. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a note she had not expected. "An apology offered so plainly is rare in this house," he said. "Most people who wrong me choose flattery over honesty when the time comes to make amends. You, it seems, prefer honesty even when it costs you something." Cordelia was not sure how to respond to that. She had expected coldness, or perhaps quiet satisfaction at watching her squirm, but instead, she found herself facing something closer to genuine curiosity, as though he were reevaluating everything he thought he knew about the woman standing before him. Supper that evening was a far more careful affair than the one that had brought them together weeks earlier. Conversation remained polite and measured, guided carefully by the Duke himself, who seemed determined to avoid any repeat of the tension that had marked their first meeting. Cordelia noticed, however, that he glanced in her direction more than once throughout the meal, his expression thoughtful rather than hostile. Her aunt, seated nearby, seemed to relax with each passing course, convinced that the worst danger had already passed. Cordelia was not so quick to relax. She could feel something shifting in the air between herself and the Duke, something she could not yet name, and she found herself both wary and strangely curious about what it might become. After supper, the guests retired to a smaller drawing room, where conversation continued in quieter tones. It was there, standing near a window overlooking the darkened gardens, that Cordelia found herself briefly alone with the Duke for the first time since her arrival. "You did not need to invite my family here," she said quietly, unable to hold back the question that had troubled her since the letter first arrived. "You could have simply let the matter fade away." "I could have," he agreed, "but I find that fading matters rarely fade completely. They linger, unresolved, until someone chooses to address them directly." "And is that what tonight is?" she asked. "An address of the matter?" He turned to look at her fully then, his expression softening just slightly, enough that she noticed the change even in the dim light of the drawing room. "Perhaps," he said, "or perhaps I simply wished to meet the woman brave enough, or foolish enough, to say aloud what most people in my position only ever hear whispered behind closed doors." Cordelia did not know how to respond to that, and for a moment, the two of them simply stood in silence, the sound of quiet conversation drifting toward them from the rest of the room. She studied his face, searching for anger or resentment, and found instead something far more unsettling. She found interest, genuine, careful interest, the kind she had not expected to find in the eyes of a man she had wronged so publicly. Whatever this visit was meant to be, Cordelia understood in that moment that it was not the punishment she had feared. It was something else entirely, something she did not yet have the words to describe, and something that left her far more unsettled than any accusation or cold dismissal could have. She excused herself shortly after, retreating to her room for the night, but sleep did not come easily. She lay awake for hours, staring at the unfamiliar ceiling above her, replaying his words again and again in her mind. Fading matters rarely fade completely. She wondered, as she finally drifted toward an uneasy sleep, exactly what kind of matter she and the Duke of Norrington had now become to one another. Morning at Norrington Hall arrived with a softness Cordelia had not expected. Sunlight poured through the tall windows of her guest room, and for a brief moment, before memory returned, she forgot entirely about the tangled situation she had walked into. Then the events of the previous evening came rushing back, and she rose from bed with a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She learned over breakfast that the gathering at Norrington Hall was not a simple visit, but a full house party, stretching across nearly 2 weeks, with guests from several prominent families arriving throughout the day. Cordelia's aunt seemed thrilled by this news, seeing in it further proof that the Duke held no lingering resentment. Cordelia, however, felt only a fresh wave of anxiety. A private supper was one thing. An extended gathering, filled with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, was another matter entirely. By midday, the halls of Norrington Hall had filled with new arrivals. Carriages rolled up the long gravel drive one after another, delivering young men eager to make impressions, older gentlemen discussing matters of business and land, and young women dressed in their finest gowns, each hoping to catch the attention of the estate's unmarried master. Cordelia watched the arrivals from a window in the upstairs corridor, feeling increasingly like an outsider among guests who clearly understood the rules of this particular game far better than she did. Among the new arrivals was a woman named Priscilla Faircloft, whose reputation preceded her by several rooms. She was beautiful in an effortless, practiced way, with golden hair arranged in perfect curls and a smile that seemed designed to charm rather than express genuine warmth. Cordelia noticed the way other guests straightened their posture when Priscilla entered a room, as though her presence alone demanded a kind of quiet competition. Louisa, who seemed to know everyone worth knowing, leaned close to Cordelia during the afternoon gathering in the main hall and offered a quiet warning. "That is Priscilla Faircloft," she whispered. "Her family has been trying to secure a match with the Duke for nearly 2 years. She does not take kindly to competition, real or imagined." Cordelia had no interest in competing for anyone's attention, least of all the Duke's, but she said nothing, choosing instead to observe the unfolding scene with careful curiosity. She noticed the way Priscilla positioned herself near the Duke whenever he entered a room, the way she laughed a little too readily at his mildest comments, the way her eyes occasionally flicked toward Cordelia with cool, assessing interest. The afternoon passed in a series of polite conversations and organized activities, walks through the garden, quiet games in the drawing room, careful discussions about art and literature designed to display wit without risking controversy. Cordelia found herself drawn into several of these conversations, despite her initial reluctance, discovering that many of the guests, whatever their motives for attending, were genuinely interesting people once she looked past the surface of practiced manners. It was during a walk through the garden that she found herself, quite unexpectedly, standing beside the Duke once again. He had joined the group of guests, taking in the afternoon air, though he walked slightly apart from the others, as was apparently his habit. Cordelia had noticed this pattern already, the way he remained present at gatherings, without ever fully surrendering himself to the noise and performance around him. When their paths crossed near a stone bench overlooking a small pond, he slowed his pace to match hers. "You seem to prefer the edges of rooms to their centers," she observed, before she could stop herself. He glanced at her with faint surprise, as though he had not expected her to speak so directly again so soon. "An interesting observation," he said. "Most guests assume I simply enjoy solitude." "And do you?" she asked. "Sometimes," he admitted, "though I have found that the edges of a room offer a clearer view of what happens at its center. People behave differently when they believe no one of consequence is watching." Cordelia considered this for a moment, watching a pair of guests laugh a little too loudly near the pond, clearly aware that the Duke stood nearby. "And what have you observed today, from your vantage point at the edges?" she asked. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of his mouth. That very few people in this garden are entirely themselves, he said, and that the ones who are tend to stand out rather sharply. Cordelia felt her cheeks warm slightly, understanding the implication, without needing further explanation. She was not entirely certain whether to feel flattered or exposed by the observation, and she found herself searching for a response clever enough to match his. Perhaps some of us have simply not yet learned the art of pretending, she said, though I understand it is considered quite valuable in circles such as these. It is valuable, he agreed, though I confess I find it exhausting to watch and refreshing to encounter its absence. Their conversation was interrupted moments later by the arrival of Priscilla, who slipped smoothly into the space beside the Duke with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to inserting herself into important moments. "Your Grace," she said brightly, "I was hoping you might settle a small disagreement among the other guests regarding the merits of the new gardens at Ashcombe Park. Surely your opinion would carry the most weight." The Duke's expression shifted subtly, becoming more formal, more distant, and Cordelia recognized the change immediately. It was the same careful mask he had worn during their first encounter at supper, the polite armor of a man accustomed to being pursued for reasons that had little to do with genuine interest in who he actually was. "I am afraid my opinions on garden design are rather ordinary," he said smoothly, though he allowed himself to be drawn away by Priscilla and the small group waiting nearby. Cordelia remained by the pond a moment longer, watching him go, and found herself surprised by the small, unexpected pang of disappointment that settled in her chest. She told herself it meant nothing, that she had simply grown accustomed to the rare comfort of speaking honestly with someone after so many days spent carefully guarding her words among strangers. She told herself this several more times over the following days, though the reassurance grew less convincing with each repetition. As the house party continued, Cordelia found herself observing the guests with growing interest, noticing patterns she had not expected. She noticed how the Duke listened more carefully than he spoke, how he asked questions rather than offering opinions, how he seemed to collect small pieces of information about each guest, without revealing much about himself in return. She noticed, too, how often their paths crossed, seemingly by accident, during walks, during quiet moments before meals, during the brief pauses between organized activities. One evening, several days into the gathering, the guests assembled for an evening of music in the grand drawing room. A young woman played the pianoforte with impressive skill, and the room fell into appreciative silence as she performed. Cordelia found herself seated near the back of the room, having arrived slightly late, and it was there that the Duke found her, settling into the empty seat beside her without comment. "You do not enjoy music," he observed quietly, during a brief pause between pieces. "I enjoy it a great deal," she whispered back. "I simply prefer honesty in performance to technical perfection, and this evening offers rather more of the latter than the former." He turned to study her with open amusement, the first true amusement she had seen cross his features since her arrival. "That is a rather dangerous opinion to voice in this house," he murmured. Half the guests present spent considerable sums ensuring their daughters could perform exactly this kind of technical perfection. "Then I suppose it is fortunate I am not attempting to secure anyone's favor through musical skill," she replied. "And what are you attempting to secure?" he asked, his voice low enough that only she could hear it. The question caught her off guard, and for a moment, she had no ready answer. She thought of her family's reputation, of the uncertain future that had brought her to this house in the first place, of the strange, unsettled feeling that had grown steadily since her arrival, one she still could not fully name. "I am not certain," she admitted honestly. "I came here expecting punishment. I find myself, instead, uncertain what I have found in its place." He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed thoughtfully on the pianist across the room, though Cordelia sensed his attention remained entirely on their conversation. "Perhaps," he finally said, "you have found something neither of us expected." Before she could ask what he meant, the music resumed, and the moment passed, leaving Cordelia with more questions than she had carried into the room. Over the following days, the pattern of their careful, quiet conversations continued, each one leaving Cordelia more intrigued and more uncertain than the last. She began to notice things about him that contradicted everything she had assumed on that first night at supper. He was not cold or careless, as she had once accused him of being. He simply guarded his warmth carefully, offering it only to those who had earned some measure of his trust, a trust that seemed, against all odds, to be slowly extending toward her. Other guests began to notice the pattern as well. Louisa mentioned it first, catching Cordelia alone in her room one evening, with a knowing look that made Cordelia's stomach twist, with something between excitement and dread. "He watches you differently than he watches the others," Louisa said. "I have seen the way men look at women they wish to impress, and the way they look at women they cannot stop thinking about. His expression, when he looks at you, belongs entirely to the second kind." Cordelia dismissed the observation quickly, insisting that Louisa was imagining connections that did not exist. But privately, she could not deny that something had shifted between herself and the Duke since that first disastrous supper. What had begun as humiliation and fear had slowly transformed into something far more complicated, something that left her lying awake at night, turning over his words and expressions with far more care than she wished to admit. Priscilla, too, seemed to notice the growing warmth between Cordelia and the Duke, though her reaction carried none of Louisa's gentle amusement. Cordelia caught her watching from across rooms on several occasions, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes carrying a sharpness that promised trouble should the pattern continue. Cordelia tried to ignore the warning signs, telling herself that whatever was happening between herself and the Duke would surely fade once the house party ended, and she returned to her ordinary life. But as the days passed and their conversations grew longer, their shared glances more frequent, she found it increasingly difficult to believe her own reassurances. One afternoon, during a quiet moment away from the other guests, she finally allowed herself to ask the question that had been building since her arrival. "Why did you truly invite my family here, Your Grace?" she asked, standing with him near the edge of the formal gardens, far enough from the house that their conversation remained private. It was not simply to hear an apology. You could have accepted a letter for that. He was quiet for a long moment, his expression unusually open, unguarded in a way she had not seen before. "I invited you here, because no one has spoken to me as honestly as you did in longer than I care to admit," he said finally. "Every person in that room believed they were speaking to a duke. You believed you were speaking to a man, and you judged him accordingly. I found I could not stop thinking about what it might mean to be judged as a man again, rather than a title." Cordelia felt something shift deep in her chest at his words, a warmth she had not expected and was not entirely prepared to face. She understood, standing there in the quiet garden with the afternoon light falling gently around them, that whatever had begun between them was no longer simple curiosity or careful courtesy. It had become something far more dangerous and far more difficult to walk away from. The days that followed brought a change in the rhythm of the house party, one that Cordelia felt in small, quiet ways rather than any single dramatic moment. The Duke began seeking her out more openly, no longer relying on chance encounters near ponds or gardens, but arranging, with careful subtlety, moments when the two of them might speak without the weight of an audience pressing in around them. One morning, he suggested a ride through the eastern fields of the estate, inviting a small group of guests to join, though Cordelia noticed he arranged the pace and direction of the ride in such a way that she often found herself beside him, slightly apart from the others, engaged in conversation that had little to do with the scenery around them. "You ride well," he observed, as their horses moved at an easy pace along a worn path bordered by tall hedgerows. "My father insisted all his daughters learn properly," she replied. "He said a woman who could not manage a horse would struggle to manage anything else worth managing." "A wise philosophy," the Duke said, though I suspect he did not anticipate his daughter managing a Duke's opinion of himself quite so thoroughly. Cordelia laughed before she could stop herself, a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised them both. It was the first time she had laughed freely since arriving at Norrington Hall, and she noticed the way his expression softened at the sound, as though he had been waiting, without quite realizing it, to hear exactly that. "I did not manage your opinion," she said, still smiling. "I merely offered it an unexpected challenge." "An understatement," he replied, "though not an unwelcome one." Their conversation continued in this easy manner for much of the ride, drifting between light-hearted teasing and quieter, more thoughtful exchanges about the estate, the tenants who worked its land, the responsibilities that came with a title. Cordelia was slowly beginning to understand, carried far more weight than she had ever considered. She learned that the Duke rose early each morning to review matters of estate business long before his guests woke for breakfast. She learned that he personally visited tenant families whenever illness or hardship struck, a practice his own father had rarely bothered with. She learned, piece by careful piece, that the cold, careless man she had accused him of being that first night did not exist at all, and had perhaps never existed outside her own hasty assumptions. In turn, he asked about her life with a curiosity that felt genuine rather than performed. He asked about her mother, who had passed when Cordelia was young, and listened without interruption as she described the handful of memories she still carried, fragments of laughter and warmth she treasured all the more for their scarcity. He asked about her sister Eliza, and smiled at the obvious affection in Cordelia's voice as she spoke of her sister's endless curiosity and stubborn optimism. He asked, too, about her own hopes, questions no one had ever thought to ask her directly before, and she found herself answering with an honesty she rarely offered anyone. "I want a life built on truth," she admitted, as their horses slowed near a quiet stream at the edge of the eastern fields. "I have watched too many marriages built on comfortable lies, and I have always feared becoming part of one myself." The Duke was quiet for a moment, watching the water move gently over smooth stones. "I understand that fear better than you might imagine," he said finally. "My own parents maintained the appearance of a contented marriage for the benefit of society, while privately living almost as strangers beneath the same roof. I swore long ago that I would never repeat their example, though I confess I had begun to believe such honesty simply did not exist between a man and woman, bound by duty rather than genuine affection." "And now," Cordelia asked quietly, "do you still believe that?" He turned to look at her then, his expression carrying a weight and sincerity that made her breath catch in her chest. "Now," he said, "I am no longer certain of anything I believed before that supper." The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them seemed ready to name aloud, until the arrival of other riders further down the path broke the spell and returned them both to the safer territory of polite conversation. That evening, Priscilla approached Cordelia directly, for the first time since the house party began, finding her alone in the corridor outside the drawing room as the guests gathered for supper. "You seem to be enjoying His Grace's attention a great deal," Priscilla said, her voice pleasant but carrying an unmistakable edge beneath the surface. "I wonder if you understand the position you are placing yourself in." "I am not placing myself in any position," Cordelia replied evenly, refusing to be baited into open conflict. "I am simply a guest in his home, as you are. A guest who insulted him publicly, and somehow found herself invited back for a fortnight," Priscilla said, her smile never wavering. "Some might call that remarkable good fortune. Others might wonder what such fortune costs a woman in the end." Cordelia felt anger rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, remembering Louisa's earlier advice about not showing weakness. "I have paid whatever cost my words demanded," Cordelia said. "Whatever happens beyond that is not a debt owed to you or anyone else watching from the sidelines." Priscilla's smile finally faltered, just slightly, before she recovered her composure and swept past Cordelia toward the drawing room without another word. Cordelia remained in the corridor a moment longer, her heart pounding, aware that she had just made an enemy far more dangerous than any she had faced before, a woman with both motive and means to cause considerable harm should the opportunity present itself. Supper that evening proceeded with careful politeness, though Cordelia noticed Priscilla watching her with renewed attention throughout the meal, her earlier friendliness replaced by something colder and more calculating. Cordelia tried to focus instead on the comfortable rhythm that had developed between herself and the Duke, seated several places away, but exchanging occasional glances that carried far more warmth than propriety technically allowed. After supper, as the guests dispersed into smaller groups throughout the house, Cordelia found herself drawn once more toward the quiet garden, seeking a few moments of solitude to settle her thoughts after the tense exchange with Priscilla. She had not expected to find the Duke already there, standing near the same stone bench where their earlier conversation had taken place, as though some part of him had known she would seek out this particular corner of the estate. "You seem troubled," he observed, as she approached. "Priscilla Faircloth does not care for the amount of time we have spent together," Cordelia admitted, deciding honesty remained her safest course, even in matters as delicate as this. The Duke's expression darkened slightly at the mention of her name. "Lady Priscilla has made her intentions toward securing my attention quite clear for some time," he said. "I confess I have found her company considerably less engaging than she believes it to be." Cordelia felt a small, unexpected relief at his words, though she quickly reminded herself that his opinion of Priscilla however dismissive, changed little about the danger the woman represented. "She strikes me as someone accustomed to getting what she wants," Cordelia said carefully, "and someone who will not easily accept losing it to a woman with far less standing than herself." "I have never much cared for the games society expects me to play," the Duke said, moving to stand beside her near the edge of the garden path. "And I find I care for them even less when they threaten to interfere with something I have only just begun to understand for myself." Cordelia turned to look at him fully, her heart racing at the quiet intensity in his voice. "And what is it you have begun to understand?" she asked softly. He reached out, taking her hand gently in his own, a gesture so unexpected and so tender that Cordelia felt her breath catch entirely. "That the woman who insulted me across a supper table, without knowing who I was or what I possessed, saw something in me that everyone else in that room had long since stopped looking for," he said. "She saw a man rather than a title, and judged him honestly for what she found. I have not felt so truly seen in all my life, and I find I am no longer willing to let that feeling slip away simply because it arrived wrapped in scandal rather than proper introduction." Cordelia's throat tightened with emotion she had not expected to feel so strongly, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, standing together in the quiet garden beneath a sky slowly filling with stars. Whatever Priscilla intended, whatever obstacles still lay ahead, Cordelia understood, in that moment, that she had crossed some invisible threshold from which there was no easy return. The man standing beside her was no longer simply the Duke of Norrington, a stranger she had wronged and sought to make amends with. He had become someone whose good opinion mattered to her more than she had ever expected, someone whose presence had settled into her heart with a quiet certainty she could no longer deny. She only hoped, as they finally returned together to the warm lights of the house, that whatever came next would prove strong enough to withstand the storm she sensed was still building on the horizon. In the days that followed the quiet moment in the garden, Cordelia found herself living within two entirely different worlds at once. In one world, she moved through the ordinary rhythms of the house party, exchanging polite conversation with guests, joining walks and games and evening entertainments, with a composed expression that revealed nothing of what stirred beneath the surface. In the other world, a private one shared only with the Duke, every glance carried new meaning. Every accidental brush of hands during a shared activity sent warmth spreading through her chest. Every quiet word exchanged in passing felt like a small treasure she carried with her long after the moment had ended. She had not expected to fall into such feelings so quickly, nor with a man whose company she had entered under such difficult circumstances, yet each day brought some new discovery about him that deepened the connection growing steadily between them. She learned that he kept a small collection of worn books in his private study, gifts from his mother before her passing, and that he still returned to certain passages when the weight of his responsibilities grew heavy. She learned that he had once considered walking away from his title entirely as a younger man, exhausted by the expectations pressed upon him from every direction, before duty to his tenants, and his family's legacy convinced him to remain, and shape the role into something he could live with honestly. In turn, she found herself sharing pieces of her own life she had never spoken of so openly before. Fears about her family's uncertain financial future, private grief over her mother's death that she had long kept carefully hidden behind practical composure, quiet hopes for a life where her voice mattered as much as her appearance or her family name. It was during one such conversation, held in the quiet hours of early evening before the other guests gathered for supper, that Cordelia finally allowed herself to voice a fear that had been building steadily since her arrival. "I worry that what has grown between us exists only within the walls of this house," she admitted, seated beside the Duke near a window overlooking the darkening gardens. "That once this gathering ends, and I return to my ordinary life, none of this will feel as real as it does now." The Duke considered her words carefully before responding, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. "I understand that fear," he said. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by people whose warmth toward me disappeared the moment circumstances changed, whose affection depended entirely on what I could offer them, rather than who I actually was. I do not intend to let what has grown between us become another example of that pattern." "And how do you intend to prevent it?" she asked quietly. He reached for her hand, holding it gently within his own, his thumb tracing a slow, reassuring line across her knuckles. "By making my intentions clear," he said, "both to you and to everyone watching, long before this gathering comes to its natural end." Cordelia felt her pulse quicken at his words, though she forced herself to remain composed, uncertain exactly what he meant, but sensing that whatever came next would carry consequences neither of them could easily undo. That certainty arrived sooner than she expected, and in a manner far more public than she had anticipated. 2 evenings later, during a formal dinner attended by nearly every guest currently residing at Norrington Hall, the Duke rose from his seat near the head of the table and requested a brief moment of everyone's attention. Cordelia's heart nearly stopped as conversation around the table quieted, all eyes turning toward their host with curious anticipation. "I know it is unusual for a host to interrupt his own supper with announcements," the Duke began, his voice calm but carrying clearly across the room. "But I find I have grown tired of allowing assumptions and quiet speculation to define matters that deserve honesty instead." Cordelia glanced toward Priscilla, who sat rigid in her chair, her expression carefully composed, but her knuckles white, where her hands gripped the edge of the table. "Several weeks ago," the Duke continued, "I attended a supper very different from this one, hosted by a family I barely knew, surrounded by guests I had never met. During that supper, a young woman spoke to me with more honesty than I had encountered from anyone in society in a great many years. She did not know my title. She judged only the man sitting before her, and found him wanting in matters of compassion and understanding. She was right to do so." A murmur passed through the assembled guests, several of them turning to look at Cordelia with dawning recognition. She felt her face flush deeply, uncertain whether to feel mortified or grateful for the sudden, unexpected attention. "I invited that family here," the Duke went on, hoping to understand why her words had affected me so deeply, and whether the honesty she offered that evening reflected the whole of her character or merely a single unguarded moment. "I have spent these past weeks in her company, and I can say with complete certainty that Miss Cordelia Ashworth possesses more genuine honesty, courage, and warmth than anyone I have encountered in my entire life." Cordelia's breath caught entirely as every eye in the room turned toward her, the weight of their collective attention almost unbearable, though she found she could not look away from the Duke's steady gaze. "I do not intend to hide this discovery behind polite silence any longer," he continued. "Miss Ashworth has shown me, through her honesty and her unwavering character, exactly the kind of partner I hope to build a life alongside, one built on truth rather than convenient appearances. I say this now, publicly, so that no one present mistakes my intentions, or believes her presence here reflects anything other than my sincere and growing regard for her." The room erupted into quiet whispers and murmured reactions, though Cordelia heard almost none of it clearly, her attention fixed entirely on the man standing at the head of the table, his expression open and unguarded in a way she had never witnessed from him before, not even during their most private conversations. Priscilla rose abruptly from her seat, murmuring an excuse about feeling unwell, before hurrying from the room, her departure barely noticed amid the general commotion the Duke's words had caused. Cordelia's aunt sat frozen in her chair, one hand pressed to her chest, while her father wore an expression of such profound shock that Cordelia might have laughed under different circumstances. The Duke returned to his seat shortly after, though not before catching Cordelia's eye one final time, his expression carrying a silent question she understood immediately. Whatever came next, whatever challenges or complications arose from his public declaration, he wanted her to know that his feelings were genuine, freely offered, and entirely his own choice, rather than any fleeting impulse of the moment. Supper resumed with considerably more energy than it had begun, guests exchanging excited whispers and curious glances throughout the remainder of the meal. Cordelia barely tasted the food placed before her, her mind still reeling from the unexpected and very public turn the evening had taken. Later that night, once the guests had finally retired and the house had settled into quiet, Cordelia slipped out onto a small balcony connected to her room, needing air and space to process everything that had happened. She was not entirely surprised, moments later, to hear soft footsteps approaching along the corridor, followed by a gentle knock at her door. The Duke stood in the hallway when she opened it, his expression carrying a mixture of hope and quiet uncertainty she had not seen from him before. "I hope I did not overstep," he said quietly. "I meant every word I spoke tonight, but I realize now that I never asked whether you wished for such a public declaration before offering one." Cordelia felt warmth spread through her chest at his obvious concern for her feelings, even after taking such a bold and public step. "You did not overstep," she assured him, "though I confess I was not prepared for quite so dramatic an announcement." A faint smile touched his lips. "I have never been particularly skilled at half measures," he admitted. "Once I understood what I felt, I found I could not continue pretending otherwise, regardless of how society expected such matters to unfold." They stood together in the quiet corridor for a long moment, the weight of everything that had changed between them settling comfortably into place, until Cordelia finally spoke the question that had been building since his announcement. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now," he said, reaching for her hand once more, "we face whatever comes next together, and we do so honestly, regardless of what obstacles Lady Priscilla or anyone else might attempt to place in our path." Cordelia did not yet know how difficult those obstacles would prove to be, nor how far Priscilla was willing to go to reclaim the position she believed rightfully belonged to her. But standing there in the quiet hallway, her hand held gently within the Duke's own, she found she was no longer afraid of whatever challenges lay ahead. She was, for the first time since that fateful supper weeks earlier, simply and completely certain of where her heart belonged. Word of the Duke's public declaration spread far beyond the walls of Norrington Hall within days, carried by departing guests eager to share such delicious news with everyone they encountered along their journeys home. By the time a week had passed, Cordelia's name had become the subject of conversation in drawing rooms across the county, whispered about with a mixture of envy, curiosity, and disbelief that a woman of modest standing had captured the attention of one of the most sought-after men in the country. Cordelia tried her best to ignore the growing attention, focusing instead on the genuine happiness that continued to build between herself and the Duke with each passing day. Their conversations grew easier, their shared laughter more frequent, and Cordelia found herself increasingly comfortable within the walls of Norrington Hall, a place that had once felt so foreign and intimidating now beginning to feel, in small but meaningful ways, like it might one day become home. The comfort, however, proved short-lived. Nearly 2 weeks after the Duke's announcement, Louisa arrived at Cordelia's room early one morning, her expression grave and unsettled in a way that immediately caused Cordelia's stomach to twist with dread. "There is a rumor spreading through the house," Louisa said without preamble, closing the door carefully behind her before continuing. "A rumor suggesting that your outburst at that first supper was not an honest mistake at all, but a calculated performance designed specifically to attract the Duke's attention." Cordelia felt the blood drain from her face. "That is absurd," she said. "I did not even know his identity that evening. How could I have calculated anything?" "The rumor claims otherwise," Louisa continued gently. "It suggests you had learned his identity beforehand, perhaps through a servant or a mutual acquaintance, and deliberately staged the insult knowing it would provoke curiosity rather than anger, understanding that a Duke tired of flattery might find honesty, even harsh honesty, irresistible." Cordelia sank onto the edge of her bed, the accusation settling over her like a physical weight. It was clever, she realized immediately, cruelly clever, twisting the very honesty she had always prized into evidence of manipulation and deceit. "Where did this rumor begin?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Louisa's expression confirmed her suspicion before she spoke. "No one can say for certain," Louisa admitted. "But it began circulating shortly after Lady Priscilla returned to her family's estate, and it has grown more detailed and more convincing with each retelling, as though someone were actively shaping it, rather than allowing simple gossip to spread on its own." Cordelia closed her eyes, trying to steady her breathing against the rising panic building in her chest. She had faced the consequences of her own honest mistake with as much grace as she could manage, but facing a deliberate, calculated lie designed to destroy her character felt entirely different, a battle she was not certain she knew how to fight. The rumor reached the Duke by that same afternoon, delivered to him through the careful, concerned whispers of guests who claimed only to wish him well. Cordelia learned of this when a servant informed her that the Duke wished to speak with her privately in his study, a request that filled her with fresh dread, despite everything they had shared over the preceding weeks. She found him standing near the window of his study when she arrived, his posture rigid, his expression carrying a tension she had not seen from him since their very first encounter. "You have heard the rumor," she said quietly, closing the door behind her. "I have," he confirmed, turning to face her. "I do not believe it, if that is your concern." Relief flooded through her chest, though it was quickly followed by fresh worry as she studied his troubled expression. "Then what troubles you?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I believe you," he said carefully, "but I have learned, through painful experience, that belief alone rarely settles matters within society. Rumors, once spread widely enough, take on a life independent of truth. I fear this one may prove difficult to fully extinguish, regardless of how firmly I stand beside you." Cordelia felt her earlier relief curdle into something closer to despair. "Then what do you suggest we do?" she asked. The Duke crossed the room slowly, taking both her hands within his own, his expression softening despite the tension still visible in his shoulders. "We do not hide," he said firmly. "We do not allow fear of gossip to dictate our choices. But I must ask you honestly, Cordelia, because the answer matters a great deal. Is there any truth whatsoever to this claim? Did you know my identity before that first supper?" The question stung, though Cordelia understood why he felt compelled to ask it directly, rather than simply assuming her innocence based on feeling alone. "I swear to you," she said, meeting his gaze without hesitation, "I had no knowledge of who you were until my cousin whispered your name to me after the damage was already done. I have never calculated anything in my life the way this rumor suggests. I say what I believe because I believe it, not because I hope it will win me anything in return." The Duke studied her face carefully for a long moment, and Cordelia held perfectly still beneath his scrutiny, understanding that this moment mattered more than perhaps any other since their acquaintance began. Finally, something in his expression relaxed, the tension easing from his shoulders as he pulled her gently into an embrace. "I never doubted you," he murmured against her hair. "I needed only to hear you say it plainly, so that when I stand before others and defend your character, I do so with complete and unshakable certainty." Cordelia allowed herself a moment to simply rest within his embrace, drawing strength from his steady presence, before pulling back to address the practical matter still facing them. "How do we stop this rumor from spreading further?" she asked. The Duke's expression turned thoughtful and determined. "We confront it directly," he said. "Rumors thrive in whispered corners and private conversations. They wither considerably faster when dragged into open daylight." Over the following days, the Duke made a point of appearing publicly alongside Cordelia at every possible opportunity, refusing to allow the whispered accusations to alter his behavior in the slightest. He spoke openly with guests who approached him with careful, probing questions, addressing the rumor directly, rather than avoiding the subject, explaining clearly and calmly that the circumstances of their first meeting had been entirely genuine, entirely unplanned, and entirely honest on Cordelia's part. Not everyone accepted his reassurances easily. Some guests, already inclined to distrust a woman who had risen so quickly in the Duke's estimation, continued to whisper their doubts despite his efforts. Priscilla herself remained conspicuously absent from Norrington Hall during this period, though Cordelia suspected her absence had less to do with genuine illness, as she had originally claimed, and more to do with the careful orchestration of rumors from a comfortable distance, where she could not be directly accused of spreading them. Cordelia found the entire experience deeply unsettling, a stark reminder that her honest nature, the very quality that had first drawn the Duke's genuine interest, could be so easily twisted into something ugly and manipulative in the hands of someone determined to see her fail. She spent long hours during this difficult period questioning whether she truly belonged in a world so quick to doubt sincerity and reward careful deception instead. It was during one such moment of doubt, shared quietly with the Duke during a walk through the estate's private gardens, that she finally voiced the fear that had been building steadily beneath her composed exterior. "Perhaps I am not suited for this life," she admitted softly. "I do not know how to fight lies with anything other than truth, and truth, it seems, carries very little weight against a determined enough rumor." The Duke stopped walking, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a fierce conviction that steadied something uncertain within her chest. "Truth carries more weight than you realize," he said firmly. "It simply requires patience and consistency to overcome deliberate deception. I have watched you these past weeks remain honest, even when honesty cost you comfort or safety. That same honesty will outlast every calculated lie Lady Priscilla or anyone else chooses to spread. Because truth, unlike rumor, does not require constant maintenance to survive. It simply exists, waiting patiently for those willing to look closely enough to see it." Cordelia felt tears gather unexpectedly at his words, moved by the depth of his belief in her character even amid such difficult circumstances. And if the rumor does not fade, she asked quietly, if society chooses to believe the lie rather than the truth, then society will have made a poor choice, he said simply, and I will love you regardless of what foolish opinions it chooses to hold. The word love settled between them with quiet, unexpected weight, the first time either of them had spoken it aloud, and Cordelia felt her breath catch entirely at the simple, sincere honesty behind his declaration. I love you as well, she admitted softly, the words feeling both terrifying and entirely natural as she finally spoke them aloud. Regardless of whatever storm we still must weather together. They stood together in the quiet garden for a long moment, the weight of the challenges still facing them, tempered by the certainty now firmly established between them. Whatever Priscilla intended, whatever further obstacles society chose to place in their path, Cordelia understood that she no longer faced them alone. She only hoped that understanding would prove strong enough to carry them both through whatever difficult confrontation still waited ahead. The opportunity to address the rumor directly arrived sooner than Cordelia expected, in the form of a grand ball hosted by one of the county's most prominent families, an event that nearly every significant household, including Priscilla's own family, was certain to attend. The Duke had already accepted the invitation weeks earlier, long before the rumor began circulating, and he made it clear to Cordelia that he intended to attend regardless of the whispers still following her name through society's careful circles. You do not have to attend if you would rather avoid the attention, he told her gently, as they discussed the matter over a quiet breakfast at Norrington Hall. I would understand completely. I have spent my entire life refusing to hide from the consequences of speaking honestly, Cordelia replied, her chin lifting with quiet determination. I do not intend to begin hiding now, especially not from a lie designed specifically to frighten me into silence. The Duke's expression softened with obvious pride at her words, and he reached across the table to take her hand gently within his own. Then we shall face this together, he said, exactly as we have faced everything else. The evening of the ball arrived with a nervous energy that Cordelia could feel humming beneath her skin as she dressed carefully for the event, choosing a gown of deep blue that Louisa insisted brought out the quiet strength in her expression. Her aunt fussed over her appearance with obvious anxiety, though Cordelia noticed a new confidence in the older woman's manner as well, a growing certainty that whatever challenges lay ahead, the family's fortunes had already shifted in ways few could have predicted weeks earlier. The ballroom, when they arrived, glittered with candlelight and the quiet murmur of hundreds of guests, their conversations pausing briefly as Cordelia entered on the Duke's arm, curious eyes tracking their progress across the room. She felt the weight of those gazes settle over her like a physical pressure, but she kept her chin lifted, refusing to shrink beneath the scrutiny. Priscilla appeared within the hour, dressed in a striking gown of pale gold, her expression carrying the same practiced warmth Cordelia had witnessed during their first meeting at Norrington Hall, though now she understood the calculation hiding carefully beneath that pleasant surface. Priscilla moved through the crowd with practiced ease, exchanging quiet words with several guests whose expressions shifted subtly toward Cordelia's direction shortly after each conversation, confirming exactly what Cordelia had already suspected about the rumor's true origin. It was during a brief pause in the evening's dancing, as guests gathered near the refreshment tables to exchange conversation, that Priscilla finally approached Cordelia directly, her smile carrying a sharp edge beneath its polished surface. I do hope the rumors circulating have not caused you too much distress, Priscilla said, her voice carrying just far enough for nearby guests to overhear. Society can be so cruel toward those who rise too quickly above their station, regardless of how such rumors might have originated. Cordelia felt anger rise sharply within her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, remembering the Duke's earlier words about truth, requiring patience rather than panic. The rumors have caused me distress, Cordelia agreed evenly, her voice carrying just as clearly as Priscilla's had. Though I confess I find myself more troubled by the character of whoever chose to spread such a deliberate falsehood than by any damage the lie itself might cause to my reputation. Several nearby guests turned their attention more fully toward the exchange, sensing the tension building between the two women. A falsehood, Priscilla repeated, her smile tightening slightly. I merely repeated what others have already been discussing at length. Then perhaps, Cordelia said, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart, those others deserve to know the full truth of the matter. rather than a carefully constructed story designed to protect its true author from suspicion. Before Priscilla could respond, the Duke appeared at Cordelia's side, having clearly overheard enough of the exchange to understand exactly what was unfolding. His expression carried a controlled fury Cordelia had never witnessed from him before, though his voice remained calm and measured when he finally spoke, carrying easily across the now attentive crowd. "Since this matter has apparently become a topic of general interest," he said, "allow me to address it directly, so that no further confusion need trouble anyone's evening. The rumor currently circulating suggests that Miss Ashworth knew my identity before our first meeting, and deliberately staged an insult to secure my attention. This claim is entirely false." A murmur passed through the gathered guests, and Cordelia felt her heart pound as the Duke continued. "I was present that evening, deliberately unrecognized, traveling under circumstances designed specifically to avoid exactly the kind of calculated attention this rumor accuses Miss Ashworth of attempting. She could not have known my identity, because I had gone to considerable trouble to ensure no one at that gathering did. Her honesty that evening was entirely genuine, and it remains the very quality I most admire and respect in her character." He turned then, his gaze settling deliberately on Priscilla, whose composed expression had begun to crack visibly beneath the weight of his steady attention. "I find it curious," he continued, his voice carrying a quiet edge of warning, "that this particular rumor emerged with such detailed conviction shortly after a certain guest departed my home under circumstances of sudden and unexplained illness. I would hope, for the sake of everyone's continued good standing within this society, that such curious timing remains nothing more than unfortunate coincidence." Priscilla's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence entirely evaporated beneath the weight of the Duke's pointed implication. Without another word, she excused herself abruptly and disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a ballroom filled with quiet whispers and dawning understanding. The Duke turned back to Cordelia, his expression softening considerably as he took her hand gently within his own. "I apologize for the scene," he said quietly. "I had hoped to address this matter with more discretion, but I found I could not stand idle while someone attempted to publicly diminish your character in my presence." Cordelia felt tears gather unexpectedly in her eyes, though they were tears of relief rather than distress. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me enough to defend me so completely." "I will always defend you," he said, his voice carrying quiet, unwavering conviction, "because I have never encountered anyone whose honesty deserved such defense more thoroughly than yours." The remainder of the evening passed in a considerably different atmosphere than its beginning. Guests who had previously regarded Cordelia with cautious suspicion now approached with genuine curiosity and warmth, several openly apologizing for having entertained such an unfair rumor in the first place. By the time the ball drew to its close, Cordelia understood that whatever damage Priscilla had hoped to inflict upon her reputation had instead collapsed entirely beneath the weight of the Duke's public and unwavering defense. As their carriage carried them back toward Norrington Hall, beneath a sky scattered with stars, Cordelia rested her head against the Duke's shoulder, exhaustion and relief settling over her in equal measure. "I did not expect tonight to end this way," she admitted quietly. "Nor did I," he replied, his arms settling comfortably around her shoulders, "though I find I am grateful it did. Sometimes the most difficult confrontations reveal exactly what we needed to understand all along." "And what have you understood?" she asked softly. He turned to look at her then, his expression carrying a warmth and certainty that left no room for doubt. "That I have found, in you, exactly the kind of partner I have spent my entire life hoping to encounter," he said. "Someone whose honesty I can trust completely, and whose character remains unshaken regardless of whatever storms attempt to test it." Cordelia felt her heart swell with an emotion too large for words, and she simply allowed herself to rest against him for the remainder of the journey home, understanding that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together, exactly as they had faced everything, since that fateful evening weeks earlier, when a single unguarded insult had somehow, impossibly, led her to this quiet, certain happiness. In the weeks following the ball, life at Norrington Hall settled into a quieter, gentler rhythm than the tension and uncertainty that had marked the preceding months. The rumor Priscilla had so carefully constructed faded quickly once its true origins became widely understood, and society, ever eager to embrace a compelling story, soon found itself far more interested in the growing romance between the Duke and the woman who had once insulted him so memorably across a supper table, than in any lingering doubt about her character. Cordelia remained at Norrington Hall through the final weeks of the house party's official duration, though she noticed the Duke found increasingly creative reasons to extend her family's welcome, well beyond the gathering's original conclusion. Her father, initially anxious about overstaying their invitation, gradually relaxed into the easy comfort of a household that seemed genuinely pleased by their continued presence, particularly given the obvious happiness evident whenever the Duke and Cordelia occupied the same room. It was on a quiet evening in early autumn, nearly 2 months after that first disastrous supper, that the Duke finally asked Cordelia to join him for a private walk through the estate's gardens, away from the watchful eyes of family and remaining guests. The evening air carried a gentle chill, and golden leaves drifted lazily from the trees lining the garden path as they walked together in comfortable silence. "I have something I wish to ask you," he said finally, stopping near the same stone bench where their earliest private conversations had taken place, the spot that had somehow become quietly significant to both of them over the preceding weeks. Cordelia felt her heart begin to race, though she kept her expression composed, waiting patiently for him to continue. "When you first spoke to me at that supper," he began, his voice carrying a warmth mixed with quiet vulnerability she had rarely witnessed from him, "you did not know my title, my fortune, or my position within society. You judged me solely on the merit of my character, and found it wanting. I have thought often, in the months since, about how rare and precious such honesty truly is, and how fortunate I am that fate arranged for us to meet under exactly those circumstances." He knelt then, drawing a small velvet box from within his coat, and Cordelia felt her breath catch entirely as understanding dawned. "I do not wish to offer you a life built on titles or fortune," he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident beneath its surface. "I wish to offer you a life built on the same honesty that first drew us together, a partnership where your voice matters as much as my own, where truth remains more valuable than convenient appearances. Cordelia Ashworth, will you do me the honor of becoming my wife, and my Duchess?" Tears gathered freely in Cordelia's eyes as she looked down at him, overwhelmed by the depth of emotion carried within his simple, sincere words. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with happiness. "Yes, I will marry you." He rose then, sliding a beautiful ring onto her trembling hand, before pulling her into an embrace that carried all the warmth and certainty their relationship had built over the preceding difficult months. Cordelia laughed through her happy tears, marveling at the impossible journey that had led her from that mortifying moment at the supper table to this quiet, perfect moment beneath the autumn trees. Word of their engagement spread quickly, and this time, the reaction from society carried none of the earlier suspicion or doubt. Guests who had once whispered uncertainly about Cordelia's rapid rise now spoke openly of the romantic story behind their union, the tale of honest insult transformed into genuine, lasting love, becoming something of a beloved legend within their social circle. The wedding took place several months later, on a bright winter morning, in the same chapel where generations of Norrington dukes had married before him. Cordelia walked down the aisle dressed in ivory silk, her sister Eliza serving as her attendant, her father's expression carrying a pride so evident it brought fresh tears to Cordelia's eyes as she approached the altar where the Duke waited. As they exchanged their vows, Cordelia found herself thinking back to that fateful supper months earlier, to the mortifying silence that had followed her thoughtless words, to the fear and uncertainty that had consumed her in the days that followed. She could never have imagined, sitting in that hallway with her aunt's disappointed words still ringing in her ears, that such a disastrous beginning would lead to this moment, standing before the man she loved more than she had ever believed possible, about to become his wife and his Duchess. The reception that followed filled Norrington Hall with laughter and celebration long into the evening. Guests who had witnessed the entire journey, from that first scandalous supper through the difficult weeks of rumor and doubt, marveled openly at the transformation they had witnessed, at the quiet strength both Cordelia and the Duke had shown in refusing to let fear or falsehood determine the course of their relationship. Louisa found Cordelia during a quiet moment amid the celebration, embracing her warmly before stepping back with a knowing smile. "Do you remember what I told you, all those months ago?" Louisa said. "That men respect strength, even when it arrives wrapped in trouble." "I remember," Cordelia replied, laughing softly at the memory of her own fear and uncertainty during those early days. "I do not think I fully understood, at the time, quite how much trouble you were about to cause," Louisa added with obvious affection, "or quite how wonderfully it would all turn out in the end." Cordelia laughed again, glancing across the room to where her husband stood in quiet conversation with her father, his expression carrying the same calm warmth she had come to treasure so deeply over the preceding months. "Neither did I," she admitted softly. "I only knew I could not stop speaking honestly, even when honesty seemed likely to cost me everything. And instead," Louisa said, "it gave you everything worth having." As the celebration continued around her, Cordelia allowed herself a quiet moment to simply appreciate the remarkable path that had led her to this day. She thought of the frightened young woman who had sat awake that first night, terrified of the consequences her unguarded words had unleashed, and she felt a quiet gratitude toward that earlier version of herself, the one brave enough, or perhaps simply honest enough, to speak truth even when silence would have been so much easier. Later that evening, as the guests finally began to depart and the grand hall grew quiet once more, the Duke found Cordelia standing near the same window where they had first spoken privately, months earlier, during that first tense evening of her arrival at Norrington Hall. "Do you remember standing here?" he asked softly, coming to stand beside her, wondering whether I intended this invitation as punishment or mercy. "I remember," Cordelia replied, smiling at the memory. "I was so certain, that first night, that nothing good could possibly come from the mess I had made." "And now?" he asked, drawing her gently into his arms. "Now," she said, resting her head against his chest, "I understand that the mess was simply the beginning of the truest, most honest thing I have ever known." Outside, snow had begun to fall gently across the gardens, where so much of their story had unfolded, transforming the estate into something quiet and beautiful beneath the winter moonlight. Cordelia closed her eyes, content in the certainty that whatever challenges still lay ahead in their shared life together, they would face them exactly as they had faced everything before, honestly, courageously, and completely together. The woman who had once insulted the Duke of Norrington across a crowded supper table had become his Duchess, and though the path between those two moments had carried more difficulty and uncertainty than she could ever have anticipated, Cordelia would not have traded a single moment of that difficult, honest journey for an easier path that might never have led her to this quiet, perfect happiness. A year passed quickly at Norrington Hall, bringing with it a rhythm of life Cordelia could scarcely have imagined during those uncertain early days. As Duchess, she took an active role in matters that had previously been left entirely to servants and stewards, insisting on visiting tenant families personally, listening to their concerns with the same honest attention that had first drawn her husband's admiration. Many of the older tenants, accustomed to distant, formal relationships with the estate's previous mistresses, found themselves surprised and quietly delighted by her willingness to sit at their tables and hear their troubles directly. Her sister Eliza, now approaching her own first season, often visited Norrington Hall, eager to learn from Cordelia's example, rather than repeat the anxious performances so many young women felt pressured into. Cordelia found great joy in guiding her sister gently, reminding her often that honesty, though sometimes costly, remained the surest foundation for a life worth living. Priscilla Faircloft, whose schemes had once threatened to unravel everything Cordelia and the Duke had built together, eventually married a wealthy merchant's son from a neighboring county, her ambitions toward Norrington Hall long since abandoned. Cordelia felt no lingering resentment toward her former rival, understanding that whatever fear or insecurity had driven Priscilla's cruel rumor likely caused the other woman far more suffering than it had ever caused Cordelia herself. The Duke, for his part, continued to surprise Cordelia with small gestures of quiet devotion, remembering details of conversations from months earlier, arranging private moments amid the demands of estate business, never once allowing the comfortable familiarity of marriage to dull the genuine curiosity and respect that had first drawn them together. Their disagreements, when they occurred, were resolved through the same honest conversation that had defined their relationship from its unusual beginning, neither of them willing to sacrifice truth for the sake of easy comfort. On the anniversary of that fateful first supper, the Duke surprised Cordelia with a quiet dinner for two, served in the very room where their story had begun so unexpectedly. "I thought you might appreciate revisiting the scene of your crime," he teased gently, as they settled into seats across from one another at the small table. Cordelia laughed, shaking her head at the memory of her own mortification that distant evening. I still cannot quite believe how thoroughly I insulted you that night, she admitted, nor how patiently you endured it. I did not endure it patiently, he corrected, smiling. I simply recognized something valuable hiding within your honesty, even as it stung considerably in the moment. And are you glad, she asked softly, that fate arranged our meeting exactly as it did? He reached across the table, taking her hand gently within his own, his expression carrying the same warmth and certainty that had guided them through every difficulty since that first uncertain beginning. I am endlessly grateful, he said, because your honest words that evening, however unkind they felt at the time, led me directly to the truest happiness I have ever known. Cordelia smiled, squeezing his hand gently, as candlelight flickered warmly between them, illuminating a room that had once witnessed such an unexpected beginning, and now held such settled, contented joy. Their story, whispered about for years afterward, among those who had witnessed its unusual beginning, became something of a favorite tale within their circle, proof that honesty, however costly it might feel in difficult moments, remained far more valuable than the comfortable pretenses so many chose instead. Cordelia never regretted the words that had once threatened to destroy her family's standing, understanding now that those very words had led her, through an unlikely and often difficult path, directly to the life and love she had always secretly hoped to find. And though society continued to whisper the story for years to come, of the sharp-tongued young woman who had once insulted a duke across a crowded supper table, none of those whispers ever carried the weight of scandal they once had. Instead, they carried only warmth, admiration, and the quiet understanding that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most enduring happiness of all.